Good morning. Good morning. Okay, my name is Douglas Griffin. We are in the book of Leviticus. This is my Sunday school class. Today's January 21st of 2024. Yes, Eng- English language is okay. The computer asks such interesting things. Um, so we're in Leviticus chapter 15. This is the book that normally stops people from reading, but they need to read it. Um, in Leviticus chapter 15, well, the interesting stuff begins. The really interesting stuff begins. And I started preparing for Leviticus a couple months ago when I was in Genesis. It's like, okay, Leviticus is coming up. That's the book. So just gonna dive in to chapter 15 and then we'll expand so we can explain the context of where this stuff is coming from. So the children of Israel, and again, Israel was a person, that's their ancestor. He had 12 kids, brought them all to Egypt. They were only supposed to be there for 5 years. Joseph says that to them. The famine's going to last 5 more years, and God brought you here so I can save you during this time of famine. Famine's over after 5 years. Israel himself, Jacob, Israel, he asks to be taken back after he dies. And even he stays like an extra 12 years, 15 years. But once he passes, he says, please bear me back in the promised land because that's where our homeland is. So they take him, they bury him, then they come back to Egypt. We're not going to stay here in the land that God gave us. We want to go back to Egypt. That's where it began. So God is having, so they're there for 200 more years, and God's having to retrain their thinking. This is what the book of Leviticus is about. You've got people who've been really seeped in uh, the gods of Egypt and all these other countries as opposed to the one true God. And they're the only nation on earth, the children of Israel, the only nation of earth who have this relationship with the one true God. Every other nation around them is worshiping idols. So if they're not worshiping God, nobody is. They have no examples. There's no Bible. There's no church to go to. There's no examples of how to worship God. There's just examples of how to worship these other gods. So God's really having to put them through a really crash course. This is about retraining their brains because you're picking up the habits of all these other nations, and I've got to retrain you. And that's the context of Leviticus, which I'll just get into more in just a minute. Okay, so Leviticus chapter 15, verse 1 and 2. Now that he's brought them out of Egypt, let me explain to you what worship is about. And so Leviticus chapter 15, verse 1 and 2. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when any man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. Um, God, there are three reasons again that God is covering these things. One is just sanitation and health reasons. There are things, obviously, that people did not understand about germs and disease and viruses, and because they're invisible. Even today, wash your hand. Oh, did I touch something that it's unclean? I can't see it. Wash your hands. Wash your hands. Wash your hands. Wash your hands before you eat. Wash your hands before you do this. Wash your hands. When you leave a place, just wash your hands because there's germs all the way and they're invisible. If we know this today after thousands and thousands of years, they really did not know this then. So if any man has a discharge from his body, and he's talking about gonorrhea, syphilis, uh, uh, it's unclean, it's disease, but they don't know that. They don't know that. These are the things that wiped out. There's not one nation that Israel dealt with, the Hittites, the Amorites, the uh, Ammonite, none of them exist any longer because all those nations were wiped out by disease. That's why God tells them, if you follow my laws, none of the diseases will come upon you that come upon those other nations. Uh, okay, so he has to tell them gonorrhea is unclean. Don't taste it to see what it is. Oh, it's a discharge. Don't. You're gonna tell them this. So, uh, okay. So I'm sorry. So the health reasons. There's also habits from other nations. What they actually had the opposite idea about bodily discharges, blood and semen and stuff that would come out of your body. They had the opposite view. They felt, ooh, this is holy. It's really interesting. These other nations. And God's saying, no, I'll tell you what's holy and what's not holy. Um, by the way, God's told them, you're unclean. That's what the first 14 chapters of Leviticus is about. You're unclean. You've got to wash your body. You before you come to the temple, before you do this and this, you got to keep these things clean. You got to do that. You're unclean. And so therefore anything that comes out of you is unclean. It's not like you're clean but blood is unclean, or you're clean but discharge is unclean, or semen is unclean. You're unclean, and what comes out of you is also unclean. So he's not calling these things unclean separate from them. He's just trying to say these things are unclean. You too. So don't use them in holy practices uh, for health reasons and also just for spiritual reasons. Because the gods of other nations, well, don't exist. But the people who serve the gods of these other nations would tell you that these things are holy. They are not. Okay, Leviticus chapter 15, verse 3. So this is what you shall do when discharge, and it's talking about gonorrhea. And this shall be his uncleanness in regard to his discharge, whether his body runs with his discharge or his body is stopped up by the discharge. It is unclean. Again, for health reasons, for spiritual reasons. Don't think that when these other nations tell you, ooh, what comes out of your body is holy. No. Okay. Verse 4. Every bed is unclean on which he who has a discharge lies, and everything in which he sits shall be unclean. Again, they don't know this. They don't know this. There's no doctor. They don't know. Oh, look what they don't know that it's a virus. Okay. And whoever touches his bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. He who sits on anything on which he who has the discharge sat shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, be unclean until evening. Because they've got to tell you this is not a natural thing. It's unclean. You may not know it, but it's unclean. And he who touches the body of him who has the discharge shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. So these are the same rules like for leprosy. Leprosy, that's unclean. That's going to kill you. Gonorrhea, that's unclean. That's going to kill you. Uh, it's spread, so don't touch the person. This is how we're going to contain it. We're going to quarantine you. We're going to, you have the Ebola virus. That's unclean. You got to be quarantined. Uh, and it happened. I'm looking in Luke chapter 5, verse 12. It happened when he was in a certain city that, behold, a man who was full of leprosy saw Jesus, and he fell on his face and implored him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Now, right up here it says, he who touches the body, up here, like you know what I'm pointing to. Leviticus 15:7. He who touches the body of him who has a discharge shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean on until even. So you're not supposed to touch someone who's unclean. Yet this man comes to Jesus and says, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Then he put his hand on him and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately leprosy left him. I'm just bringing this up just to remind us, again, no one touches the leper. No one touches they've been following the law. Jesus, though, says, that's not my desire that you stay unclean. It's God's desire that you be cleansed. I'm not trying to judge you permanently. When these things happen, quarantine for a while, wash everything, and then believe that healing will come. Don't ostracize the person for life, because there are all these rules for it. Now, once they're clean, here's how you deal with them. But Jesus says, yes, I'm willing, and he touches him because once God decides that you're clean, you're clean. And before we see the manifestation, I just want to bring that up. Before you see the physical manifestation, it's already done as far as God is concerned. So that's why he can lead Abraham to a country that's not his. Hey, Abraham, I want you to go to Israel. Leave the Ur of Chaldees. I want you to go to Canaan because I've given it to you. Even though you don't see it yet, even though it's just you, eventually your people will be fill this land of Israel, and right. So we start in motion sometimes before we see the manifestation. So Jesus is already because God already knows it's going to happen. God's not hoping. It's already happened as far as he's concerned. So he reaches out and he touches him, and immediately the leprosy leaves him. Uh, Leviticus chapter 15, verse 8. If he who has the discharge spits on him who is clean, then he shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. So if somehow saliva got on the person who is clean, but you've got gonorrhea, you're unclean, you got to wash. Don't just ignore that. And I'm just telling you, they would ignore that. Don't ignore it. Wash. You're unclean. Um, Now, the reason I'm bringing it up because that's what the next scripture is, Leviticus 15:8. But I want to make a point that he's not saying all saliva is unclean. He's saying this in this specific situation, if he who has the discharge spits. Now, we want to take scripture sometime and make them very broad. And this means all spit for all time is unclean. And I'm saying, no, this is very specific because what's coming up is very specific. In Leviticus, it's very specific. It means in this situation, this is unclean. Just in this situation, spit is not unclean. If somebody has gonorrhea spits, someone has leprosy spits on you, they could be carrying virus in their saliva. God's got to let them know that. In Mark chapter 8, verse 22, talking about Jesus, he says, he then came to Bethsaida and they brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. Now he had touched another blind man, touched this one. Jesus went, Verse 23, so he took the blind man by the hand and he led him out of town. Why? Because if they saw what Jesus did, they were going to freak out because they think all spit for all time is unclean. It says, and when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands on him. So Jesus takes the man outside the city and spits on his eyes. He knows that they, in error, think all spit for all time is unclean. No, just if the person has gonorrhea in that one situation, God is very narrow. That spit is unclean. But there's healing properties in saliva, doctors have discovered. But Jesus spits on him, just spits him right on his eyes, and then puts his hands on him and asks, do you see anything? And he looked up and said, I see men like trees walking. So it's fuzzy, but I kind of see something. I've been blind and now I see something. Verse 25 of Mark 8. Then he puts his hands on his eyes again and makes him look up, and he's restored and saw everyone clearly. So he's not unclean. I know you're with me, but I just got to emphasize this because when I come up to next, your brain is going to do the opposite. Because right now, yeah, we get it. Spit's not unclean, only in that one instance. Mark chapter 7, verse 32, different situation. Then they brought to him one who was deaf and had an impediment in his speech. Right? Right? And they begged him to put his hands on him, touch him. And he took him aside from the multitude. Let me get away from these people because they'll freak out. And he put his fingers in his ears and he spat and touched his tongue. And he touched his tongue. So he didn't spit into his mouth. He spat and then he touched his tongue. Spit. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, he breathed out, right? It's the same kind of breathing out he did at the Lazarus tomb. And says, Ephatha, which is be opened. And immediately his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was loosed, and he spoke plainly. So, guy's mute, spit heals him. Guy's blind, and just in this instance, spit doesn't mean, and so therefore, spit on everybody who's blind. God's very specific. In this instance, this is how this worked. John chapter 9, verse 6. And when he had said these things, this is the man who was born blind, a different man who was born blind. He spat on the ground and made clay with his saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the man with the clay. And he said to him, go, wash in the pool of Siloam. And so he went and washed, and he came back seeing. And the spittle that he made with the clay, the mud, healed him. Okay, so 3 instances, God spitting, Jesus, and there's nothing unclean about it. It's just that specific situation. The person with gonorrhea spits on you. Okay, let's see if you can stay specific to just this specific situation. Leviticus chapter 15, verse 13. And when he who has a discharge is cleansed of his discharge, when the gonorrhea is gone, then he shall count for himself 7 days for his cleansing and wash his clothes and bathe his body in running water. So let's make sure it's cleared up. You don't see any signs of it, you may still be a carrier. So wait 7 days, bathe his body in running water, and then he shall be clean. On the 8th day, he shall take for himself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and come before the Lord. So now you get to come to the tabernacle, come to the temple, come to the tabernacle. In the wilderness, it was the tabernacle. When they got to Israel, it was the temple. Now you come and make a sacrifice to the door of the tabernacle of meeting and give them to the priest. So once you've been healed of your discharge, same thing with the leprosy in the previous chapter, just like Luke 5, chapter 14, with the guy with the lepers. Jesus healed them. He says, he charged them, tell no one, but go and show yourself to the priest and make an offering for your cleansing as a testimony to them, just as Moses commanded. Thank you, God, because, the offerings sometimes were for sin, sometimes were for praise, they were for thanksgiving, they were to acknowledge God's blessing in your life. There's different reasons to give offerings. So you're acknowledging God's blessing, that God has blessed you. You're thanking God. Here we go about that. Okay. Leviticus chapter 15, verse 16. Okay. Now, here we go. If any man has an emission of semen, then he shall wash all his body in water and be unclean until evening. Is this just like with the spitting? Anytime a man has an emission of semen, is this anytime? Then he shall wash all his body and be unclean until evening. Here's what this is referring to. The gods of other nations, the priests of other nations, believed that a man's semen was holy. That because they know, oh, this is what led to fertilization. The woman got pregnant because of it. So it must be holy. And so we should use his semen for various things. To fertilize the land, to fertilize other people, for strength, for vitality. That's what they began to believe in other nations. God wants you to know, no, you're unclean. Man's semen is unclean. It's not holy. It's not different than him. Whatever, if you're unclean, whatever comes out of you is unclean. Only Jesus is clean. Only God is clean. That's why you have to come to the temple every day and sacrifice. So don't think that the semen is a holy thing, but that's what they taught in other nations. Because they look, it produced children. It must be holy. We got to use it for all sorts of stuff. So they created something called ritual prostitution, ritual sacred holy temple prostitutes. That's a thing in all these nations that were all around them. And so God had to talk specifically against it. Again, using semen for holiness and fertilizing, and it's a holy thing. God's like, no, that's not a thing. Those other nations are making that up. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 29, it says, when the Lord your God cuts off from before you the nations, Deuteronomy 12, verse 29, when the Lord your God cuts off from before you the nations which you go to dispossess, so I'm about to send you into those, where all those, and again, Egypt was doing the same thing, but especially the nations I'm about to send you to, and you displace them and you dwell in their land, I'm about to send you over there, because these are the laws he's given to them to prepare them for where they're just about to go, even though it took them 40 years to get there because they messed up. But it's still, I'm preparing you for these nations you're going to run into. Verse 30 says, take heed to yourself that you are not ensnared to follow them after they are destroyed from before you, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, well, how did these nations serve their gods? I also will do likewise. So he's warning them, don't follow the practices of these other nations. This is so we have to know, well, what did the other nations do? This is not in general, they wore turtlenecks. So it's not in general. There's specific things that these other nations did. So we have to study the Babylonian culture and the Egyptian culture and the Hittite culture and the Amorite culture. What did they do when they worshiped their gods? How did these nations serve their gods? I will do likewise. He says, don't say that. Of course, they did. And this is what the law is addressing. I'm trying to get you prepared for what you're about to do. So I'm teaching you how to worship me, and I'm teaching you don't do what they did. Verse 31 of Deuteronomy 12, you shall not worship Lord your God in that way. For every abomination to the Lord which he hates, they have done to their gods. And then he gives the extreme example, like we would. For they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. That's how far they go. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 26. So we're coming up to Leviticus 18. And I just want us to know that all of this stuff, the previous 14 chapters, well, the chapters 1 through 12, because it's all about, here's how you worship me. Hey, here's how you make yourself holy for me. You come and you sacrifice and you watch this and you do that. But the ways that they're going to tell you to be holy, they're wrong. They're crazy. They even burn their sons and daughters, thinking that will make them holy. Leviticus 18, verse 26. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, either any of your own nation or any stranger who dwells among you. Don't pick up the habits when people come to you. For all these abominations the men of the land have done, where I'm about to send you, they do these terrible things, who are before you, and thus the land is defiled. Lest the land vomit you out also when you defile it, as it vomited out the nations that were before you. I judge them, I'm going to judge them. They had to leave, you're going to have to leave if you do the things that they do. Verse 30. Therefore you shall keep my ordinance, so that you do not commit any of these abominable customs which were committed before you got there, and that you do not defile yourselves by them. I'm the Lord your God. I'm the only God. Don't do, because now again, the ritual sacrifices, is all that they had that preoccupied them night and day. They didn't go off and watch television. They didn't go watch sports. They didn't have the Rams fighting the Saints. Or there were no magazines. There were no books. There were no movies. There were no malls to go shop in. There was nothing else to do other than their worship of these gods. It consumed them night and day. There was nothing else to think about. So they formed their whole lives around worship to these gods that they thought controlled them. That was their entertainment. That was their factual, I mean, they weren't real facts, but that's how they saw the world. And so they woke up wondering what the gods were going to do, and they went to bed wondering what the gods would do, and they did everything they did to please the God, and because they didn't understand, like, why does it flood sometimes, and why does the sun shine sometimes, why does it rain, why does it snow, why does this happen, why do the locusts come sometimes? It must be the gods, they're capricious, and God's saying, no, God, like, here's specifics Do these things and you'll be blessed. Do these things, you'll be cursed. You don't have to wonder. But they did. They wondered because they didn't have a relationship with the true God. So they made up things. They made up things in order to please the gods. He says, don't do those things. I'm writing this whole book of Leviticus to keep you from doing those things. They did them anyway, before they even got to those lands because they were already doing them. Because you're thinking, well, then they're not going to pick up those habits till they get there. They were already doing them. In Joshua chapter 24, right as they're about to go into the land, Joshua says to them, because 40 years went by, right? Joshua chapter 24, verse 2. Joshua said to all the people, thus says the Lord your God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in old times, and they served other gods. So Abraham's daddy served other gods. Abraham's brother served other gods. And so this was not a new thing that they were going to be introduced to once they got there. This had been going on. Now, therefore, because, Abraham's from the Ur of Chaldees. He's from Babylon. That he was raised in Babylon, and then he went up to Syria. So that's Iran. He's Iraq. He's raised in Iraq, went up to Syria, and then came back down into Israel. But he grew up in that culture. His family grew up in that culture. God tried to re-educate them. In verse 14 of Joshua 24, it says, now therefore fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity. And in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. So they've crossed the river, Jordan. He says, put away the gods that your fathers served for those 40 years while they were in the wilderness and in Egypt. So even though God brought them out across the Red Sea from Egypt, they had little idols that they carried with them, and they served them while they were in the wilderness. He says, put them away, please. But they were so ingrained in their culture. Ingrained. He says, serve the Lord. Verse 20, because he warns them. Joshua 24. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do harm and consume you. After he's done you good, he'll come and do you bad. So stop serving these other gods. So even though God is warning them, they are doing these things. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen talks about it. So I'm just letting you know that it didn't happen once they crossed over. They were already doing these things. And so God is telling them, don't do this. Your blood is not a holy thing. Your semen is not a holy thing. Don't use it in these temple practices that these other people do. Then God Acts chapter 7. This is Stephen preaching, verse 42. Then God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven. God okay, I give up. Worship worship the stars, worship all these other things that you worship. As it is written in the book of the prophets. So he's quoting Amos or Hosea. Did you offer me slaughtered animals and sacrifices during 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? Verse 43. Well, you also took up the tabernacle of Moloch. Moloch is the Babylonian god. And the star of your god, Remphan, and images which you made to worship. And I will carry you away to Babylon. He's warning them. You in those 40 years while you came to the temple, you would go home to your tent and do the same. You were worshiping Moloch and these other gods in the wilderness. So God's fighting this because, again, it's consuming their day and night, the worship of these other gods. They had nothing else to do. And so God's trying to break them of the habit. Didn't work. So he says, you're going to end up being carried away to Babylon since that's what you were still worshiping, the gods of Moloch. Well, how did that start? Genesis chapter 31. So remember Abraham, Isaac. So Abraham's daddy served foreign gods. His brother served foreign gods. In Jewish literature, they believe that his father actually made idols and sold them. It doesn't say that specifically in the Bible. It just says that he served them. His brothers served them. Abraham, Isaac, Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob goes up to Abraham, to his uncle's house, Laban, and then he's there for 20 years or so. He has 12 kids. Actually, he has 11 kids. Benjamin's born in Israel. But he has 11 kids there up in Syria where Laban lives. And then he leaves all of a sudden. And then Laban chases after him. In Genesis chapter 31, verse 30, it says, "And now you have surely gone." So Laban's, here's, I know why you left, Abraham. You have surely gone because you greatly long for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods? So Laban looks, and all of his gods are missing. Uh, Little idols that people would carry with them. So for the 20 years that Jacob is there, Laban's worshiping other gods. So much so, they were so enamored of these other gods because at this point, only Jacob has heard the voice of the one true God. Only Jacob, who had that experience where he went to sleep and he had that vision, Jacob's ladder, the angels descending and ascending, and God spoke to him there. For 20 years, he's up with living with Laban, and his family, his kids, are being raised on these other gods. So much so that they stole them when they left. Verse 34 of Genesis 31. Now Rachel had taken the household idols and put them in a camel's saddle and sat on them. And Laban searched all about the tent but did not find them. He's looking for his God. I want my gods back because how am I going to worship them unless I have them? Because they don't believe in the one true God, right? You got it. Okay. Verse 35, but she said to her father, let it not displease my Lord that I cannot rise before you. So she's sitting on the horse. All the idols are in the camel's saddle, right? And she's sitting on them. And she says, oh, I would get up, but she says, but I'm, for the manner of women is with me. And he searched but did not find his idol. So he's upset, like, oh man. So he leaves. She still got all of them. The children know that their mother, Jacob's favorite wife, worships these idols. Their uncles do. They never let that go. They went directly from there a few years later to Egypt and lived in Egypt and worshiped the gods of Egypt. That's why God says, I'm attacking the gods of Egypt in Exodus. I'm coming against the gods of Egypt. And every single plague he did was an attack on a god of Egypt that they thought was real. And God's trying to show you, I'm the only true God. But don't forget, as soon as the children of Israel left Egypt and Moses went up in the mountain for 40 days, they said, let's go back. Let's make an idol and go back. And that wasn't like some strange thing. They believed in the gods of Egypt, and it never changed. They believed in the gods of Babylon. That's what their ancestors worshiped, the gods of Babylon, Moloch. Now, Babylon custom compels that every woman of the land has to sit in the temple of Aphrodite and have intercourse with some stranger at least once in her life. You become a temple prostitute. And every woman, this is Babylonian custom, at some point in your life, because they had so little regard for women, and you have to be a temple prostitute. Every single woman has to do it at least once, and you have to wait for not your husband, not a stranger comes, has sex with you, and then he spreads it out in the temple. His emission in the temple. And that's how he fertilizes the land. That's his offering to the god. They believed in the intimacy, like, this is how I get close to Murloc. Murloc's wife was Ashtoreth. And you hear all about all throughout the Bible when you've got to tear down the Asherah poles, because they were always worshiping Moloch's wife. I keep saying Murloc. Moloch's wife, who's Asherah. And so they're always worshiping her. And this is one way you worshiped her. You would have sex with a temple prostitute, but then you would spread your semen on the ground in the temple. God's saying, don't do that. Okay. Now, what he would say, he would give her money, throw money at her, and he said, I invite you in the name of whichever God he was worshiping, and he believed that that God would come down and inhabit her, and he was being intimate with that God. She was now being the priestess for that God. This is how I'm getting intimacy with that God, and then this is how I show my love. Okay. Okay. So let me keep going. So um, this was a thing that they would worship these gods in this way, and God saying, "Don't do that." That's why he's saying your mission is not holy; it's unclean. Don't think because they were taught your semen is holy. Go to the temple, have sex with the temple prostitute, and then let it spread out on the ground, and because it's holy and it will fertilize the land. No, it's not. You're unclean. Your semen's unclean. Your blood's unclean. Everything that comes out of you. You're not holy. Your blood can't do anything. Your semen can't do anything. But that's what they were taught. In Genesis chapter 38, so Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob has his son Judah. You know this story. Judah took a wife. It says in Genesis chapter 38, verse 6. Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. We've gone over this. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him. We don't even know what he must have been. Horrible person. He could have been a wife abuser. I don't know what he did. Doesn't say. So Judah said to Onan, the next born son, because that's the law, the next born son is obligated to give her, the wife of the firstborn, an heir so that that son's line can continue. So he says, go to your brother's wife, marry her, and raise up to her an heir to your brother. So that child will be your brother's child. And then he will carry on your brother's line. But Onan knew that the heir would not, verse 9, be his. And it came to pass when he went into his brother's wife, he goes into his brother's wife, that he admitted on the ground, like, no, I'm not going to let you get pregnant, lest he should give an heir to his brother. And the thing which he did displeased the Lord, therefore he killed him also. So he's purposely depriving his brother. No, I'm going to not continue this line. He's breaking the law because I want my son from my wife that I choose to inherit everything. Not my brother. He's not even here. So I'm not going to do it. So he's breaking the law. God's not okay. So Genesis 38 verse 16. So the Tamar still has no heir. First brother's dead, second brother's dead. Promised it to the third brother, and then Judah forgot about it, as we know, right? So she's got no heir. All three sons, two are dead and one Judah forgot. So she goes, she puts on robes and she dresses herself like a temple prostitute. He turned her, and so Judah's on his way to shear his sheep. In verse 16 of Genesis 38, he says, he turned to her by the way and said, please let me come into you. He doesn't recognize this as his daughter-in-law. Let me come into you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law, it says. So she said, what will you give me that you may come into me? Now remember, you go to the temple, and sometimes they were outside the temple, and then you would carry the semen into the temple, or you would run into the temple. Anyway, so they would give them the money outside the temple. What were you going to give me that you may come into me? So he gives her many things. Then he goes back later to collect, because I'm going to have a whole bunch of money from the shearing of sheep. Well, give me this stuff as a promise. Give me your ring, give me your this and that as a promise, so that you will return with money. When he comes back, Genesis chapter 38, verse 21 says, then he asked the men of that place, saying, where is the harlot who was openly by the roadside? And he uses a specific word, kedesha. And this is very important because there's a word for prostitute, which is zona. And then there's a word for temple prostitute, which is kedesha. And that they're two different things, because there's just the common prostitute and then there's the temple prostitute. So where is the temple prostitute? He uses that word, kedesha, who was openly by the roadside. So that's why I'm making this up. That's the word they use for it. And they said, there was no Kadesha in this place. There's no harlot in this place. So he returned to Judah and said, I cannot find her. Also, the men of the place said, there was no harlot in the place. There was no temple prostitute. Uh, so the Hebrew Bible uses two different words for prostitute, Zona and Kadesha. Again, Zona is ordinary prostitute. Kadesha means, it's taken from the word Kadesh. So Kadesha is the feminine form of Kadesh, Kadesha. Kadesh means set apart one. Kadesh, the holy one. And in the context, it means she's set apart to be a temple prostitute. That's what she's set apart for. And then there's just the common prostitute, Zona. Okay. They are not interchangeable, even though the translation uses them like, oh yeah, it's a harlot, it's a harlot. Two different things. Zona, which means prostitute, occurs 93 times in the Bible. Kadesh is only used in three places. 93 times, because normally we're talking about a prostitute. But a Kadesha is a specific thing, a cult temple prostitute. It's only used 3 times. Kadesha. Okay, so let's look at when it's used. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 17, it says, there shall be no ritual. Well, they translated ritual harlot. But that means Kadesha. It means a cult prostitute. Don't you have those like the other nations do? There shall be no Kadesha of the daughters of Israel, or a Kadesh. That's a male temple prostitute of one of the sons of Israel. So you've got two things. Now, they translated one ritual prostitute, and they translate the other perverted one. But it doesn't mean perverted one. It means the opposite. It means sacred one. That's just a choice of the translator. Oh, they're talking, because in the temple, you've got the men who would go to the women to spread their semen, and also they use the men in the same way. There was male cult prostitutes, temple prostitutes, that this is where you'll get, and they always had to be young, they had to be virgins, and you use them in the same way, and you get from them virility and strength. So the old men would go in and spread your semen on the temple. So he says, don't have either one. Don't have the Kadesha or the Kadesh. He says, of the daughters of Israel or Kadesh of the sons of Israel. Hosea chapter 4, verse 14. And this is, because again, this word Kadesh is only used 3 times. I will not punish your daughters when they commit harlotry, nor your brides when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go apart with harlots. So he's just talking about very specific, when they commit harlotry, talking about prostitution, or your brides when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go apart with the harlots, and they also do this other thing. They offer sacrifices with the Kadesha, with the ritual prostitutes, the temple prostitutes. So these are 3 different things. The prostitutes, adultery, and they also offer sacrifices with these ritual harlots, these ritual prostitutes. Therefore, people who do not understand will be trampled. Here's the other places. Now, those are the only time that word Kadesh is used, and it's always used in the context of offering sacrifices. Kadesh, the male prostitutes. Temple prostitutes, and it's for that specific thing. This is as specific as spit coming out of a person who has gonorrhea. Spit is not evil, only if you have leprosy or gonorrhea and you spit on somebody. But Jesus spit 3 times, so it's very specific. When he's talking about this is the same specificity. In 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 24, it says, there were also, now here's the translation. The King James says perverted persons, but it says no. It's just the word Kadesh, which actually means separated, holy ones. But it's referring to the cult prostitutes, the temple prostitutes. We're talking about the male ones. These are the male ones. So it's a choice to translate it as perverted, but that's a choice because it's the opposite, because it just means cult temple prostitutes. God still doesn't like the practice. I'm just saying, but the word doesn't mean perverted. It means temple prostitutes. So there were also temple prostitutes in the land. And they did according to all the abominations of the nations which the Lord had cast out from before the children of Israel. So they used these men in this way in the temple. I, and I, he doesn't mention any other time. He's talking about specifically in the temple, just like having sex with a woman is not evil. It's bad if you use it in the temple in this way. He says that they use the men in the same way. And he's talking about the Israelites using men, the Kadesh, in this way. In 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 11, Asa did was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did his father David, and he banished the Kadesh from the land. Now, even though they translated perverted, it just means the temple, the male prostitutes, the male temple prostitutes from the land, and removed all the idols that his father had made, because they would stand next to the idol. So you'd stand next to the idol, and supposedly the spirit of Moloch, would possess you. And then this way you're being intimate with Moloch, and he's blessing you in that way, but then you would allow your semen to spread out in the temple floor. And you're fertilizing your land, and you're fertilizing your temple, and you're doing all that, and that they're using them in that way. Same, they were women, the Kadeshah, and they were Kadesh. 1 Kings chapter 22, verse 45. Because Israel continued to do this, even though God warned them about it in Leviticus. Now, the rest of the acts of Jehoshaphat, the might that he showed and how he made war, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? So I don't even have to go into it, he's saying. 1 Kings 22, verse 46. And the rest of the, translated perverted persons, but it's Kadesh, who remained in the days of his father Asa, he banished from the land because they had them. Israel was doing the very same thing. 2 Kings chapter 23. Therefore, he tore down the ritual booths of the perverted persons, but it should be just translated of the male cult prostitutes, because they would have booths. Come to me. And the women too. Come to me. Interestingly, again, I'm just saying, they mentioned it 3 times. If it's a female, it's 9 times male, which says to me it happened a lot with the guys. But again, it was thought to give them power, to give them virility. And that's what they believed. And I want this God to love me, so let that God possess you right now. I'll have sex with you, and then I'll pull out, and that's, I'll bless the land. And God's saying, that's crazy. Don't do that. Okay. Then he tore down the booths of the Kadesh that were in the house of the Lord, where the women wove hangings for the wooden image. The women even made images of the gods that were going to come and possess you. They brought them into the temple, which is God saying, don't, because they were in the Babylonian temples, they were in the Hittite temples, so they would just bring them into the temple of God. And the male prostitutes would be there waiting, and the female prostitutes would be there, and then, so they didn't separate God from these other gods. Job chapter 36, verse 13. But the hypocrites in heart store up wrath. They do not cry for help when he binds them. They die in youth, and their life ends among the Kadesh, because they are not careful. They're not following my law. They get these diseases because they put these male prostitutes in them. They have sex with them in the temple, and they make sure they're young, because they think they're going to be virile. And he says, God's saying, don't do that. So when he says, do not, if a man has an emission of semen, it's unclean. It's not a holy thing. He's not saying, obviously he's not saying sex is bad, and he's saying, because you have to know the practices of these other nations. He warns them, I'm writing this to you so that you do not do what the other nations do. You're going into their land, and if you do what they do, I'm going to kick you out just like I'm kicking them out of their land. So don't do these things. And now he's listing what the things are. So in context, Leviticus is, I'm trying to teach you how to worship me, and I'm fighting against what you have been doing for hundreds of years. When Abraham's father, who worshipped idols, Abraham's brother worshipped idols, Rachel stole idols and brought them. You've been worshiping while you were in Egypt. You worship other idols. When I took you out, you even made an idol and tried to go back to Egypt for 40 years in the wilderness. You worship these idols. This is what you're doing, and I'm trying to teach you how to worship me. The book of Leviticus is not just God sitting down saying, I'm gonna give you a bunch of religious rules. It's like I've got to correct what you have planted in your brains. You're doing these terrible things, and you're going to pick up the habits of these other people. And I just want to skip to, and this is the last verse I'm going to read, and then I'll stop. So maybe I'll get partway through Leviticus 15. Leviticus 15, verse 18. He says, and also when a woman lies with a man. So in the previous verse, when he says a man has an emission, he's talking about with the male cult prostitute, and now he's saying, and also when a woman lies with the man, and there's an emission of semen. So what was happening early in the first verse? If you now, and also in addition, yes, because that's not what I was talking about in the first verse. Now I'm talking about, and when a woman lies with a man, and there's an emission of semen. He's not condemning all sex. He's talking about very specific, just like the spit was specific. He's talking about very specific. They shall bathe them, and they're unclean. It's unclean. Don't think that there's something holy like they teach you in the Babylonian culture, and bring that woman into the temple and have sex with her right in the temple and then let it spread out over. That's their practices. Your semen is not holier than you. If you're unclean, your semen's unclean. If you're unclean, your blood is unclean. It's all unclean. So don't think it's clean. And use it to fertilize the land, and they're making that stuff up. That's like that scripture where God said, "Do not boil the baby goat in the milk of its mother." And you're thinking, why would somebody just do that? That sounds so random. It's not random. That's what these other gods they practiced, these other places. And so God's naming specific things that these other nations do, and says don't do them. And if we don't have a context for that, if we don't know what the other nations do, then we're like, I don't understand what these are in the Bible. So you have to kind of study the practice of the other nations, go, oh, this is what God's talking about when he says don't do that, because that's what they were doing. So here's just an example. In Numbers chapter 25, while they're in the wilderness, this has happened like a year later after God gave them the law. Numbers chapter 25, verse 1 says, now Israel made an acacia grove. So God gave them the whole law. It says, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. So Moab, people from Moab came and again, this is on this side of the Jordan, and before they crossed over to the promised land. Even though God has given them the law and said what to do, they immediately start going and commit harlotry with the women of Moab, who were temple prostitutes. Verse 2, they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods. And the people ate and bowed down to their gods. Come over here and worship with us. Even though God specifically told them not to, that's what God is addressing. Verse 3, so Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. Then the Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and hang the offenders before the Lord out in the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. Like, punish these people because you're worshiping other gods and taking up their practices, even though I just gave you all these laws saying don't do that. So Moses said to the judges of Israel, every one of you kill his men who were joined to Baal of Peor, because these are the things that are going to destroy your nation. I've got to preserve the children of Israel. And here's the three things that might destroy you: is your own health habits. You're going to sabotage yourself. I'm going to give you the law so you don't kill each other, like don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. Or also, the third reason I'm giving you this law is so that I don't have to destroy you because your sin is so great. You don't destroy yourself with all these diseases. Don't kill your brother, and don't let me have to destroy you either. These are the three reasons I'm giving this law. So I've got to stop you from worshiping these other gods, the Moabites and the Midianites. Got to stop you from doing that. So verse 6 says, and indeed, one of the children of Israel came and presented to his brethren a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses. Hey, here's a temple prostitute. And Moses is standing right there. And in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. They're standing right outside the tabernacle. which is where the temple prostitutes would stand. You'd have sex with her on the outside, and then you'd run in the inside and spread out your semen on the inside the temple. Okay. Now, verse 7. Now, when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand. And he went after the man of Israel into the tent. He went into the tabernacle with the woman so they could finish having sex and he could spread his semen on the floor. And he thrust both of them through, so they were still having sex, and the man of Israel and the woman through her body. And so the plague was stopped among the children of Israel. So these are the practices that they're, so when he says, when a man lies with a woman, his emission is not holy, it's unclean. It's because they believe the other nations said, oh, your emission is holy, it's clean. So have sex right in the temple and then go inside and spread your semen because it's holy. That's what God means by it's unclean. You're unclean and you've got to go through all this stuff in order to be clean before me. Trust me, your blood and your semen is also unclean. Stop using it in the temple. So he's not condemning all sex or something. He's just saying this is specifically to these practices by these other nations that he's talking about. And this continues in Leviticus 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. He's addressing these acts that these other nations were doing that they were picking up and in some cases doing right in front of them, right in front of, So I'm going to stop there. We'll finish Leviticus chapter 15 next week and go into 16. But 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, there are things that we thought that people have used these scriptures for years to condemn all sorts of stuff. But God is very specific of what he's talking about. He's very, and so we'll get into it. Okay, so thank you so much for tuning in and putting up with the craziness. And next week I'll continue. On Wednesdays, I'm in the book of Luke. We're studying the book of Luke in the New Testament. All right, thank you so much, and God bless you.